Watch out weekend indeed. Lots of top 15 teams falling in this one, and not a great weekend to go apple picking. I know some people talked about that very fact, but tough weekend for that indeed. Headlined obviously by this result: Alabama stunned by Vanderbilt, 40-35 up there in Nashville, Tennessee, and this is a historic win for Vanderbilt. And if anybody of you, anyone out there who's listening, watching, however you're getting your podcast, did you see everything that was going on Twitter about these goalposts that were making their way down Broadway? It was about a 56-minute walk from the stadium into the Cumberland River where the goalposts ended up finding themselves. And there's just this posse, this horde of Vanderbilt students taking these goalposts from point A to point B. And I think they were just running around in large groups and no one really had a plan. They just sort of figured they'd figure something out. And now they've since retrieved everything from the Cumberland River, and now all of that stuff is being used for donations and everything else. And they're going to chop it up and sell it off. But honestly, one of the most incredible football games, one of the most unbelievable responses I've seen on social media. Look, Alabama is the godfather of the SEC. They just are. That's just how it is. Vanderbilt, the antithesis of that. They're probably the cellar dweller. They are the bottom of the totem pole. But if I told you that the Commodores controlled this game from start to finish, that's pretty much what happened. Just an unbelievable result there. 13-0 at one point. It was 23-7 at one point. It was 40-28. They held the ball for a whopping 42 minutes in this game. 12 of 18 on third down. There were a couple moments where I felt like Alabama was like, all right, like, here we go. They're about to come back into this game. Ryan Williams scored that crazy touchdown, and which just seems to be commonplace at this point, that we're destined to have a Ryan Williams acrobatic catch. But they cut the lead down to 30-28. But then Vanderbilt just stays steady, scores 10 straight points after that, and they go away and they get this win. So unbelievable game from Vanderbilt.
Yeah, it's interesting because, I don't want to undersell the impact of the upset, but I don't want to oversell it either. This is like not the biggest upset in SEC history, and I'm not suggesting you said that, but let's just be realistic about what it was. They were 22, 23-point underdogs, and going by the name of the programs, I understand it. But I also think we have to give Vanderbilt credit for what they've been doing, not just this Saturday, but over the course of this season. I mean, I know they went into Georgia State a couple of weeks ago. They lost a tight one there. They beat Virginia Tech to open the season. They put Missouri on the road to the brink. If the end game for Missouri goes differently, or are we really sitting here with a subtitle that says "stunned by Vanderbilt"? I mean, if they potentially could have knocked off two top 10 opponents if a slight change of how that Missouri game ends. So I understand the premise behind it here. But let's also not pretend that this was some miracle victory. Vanderbilt took it to Alabama. This was not like a series. Yeah, this was not a series of like ball bounced weird and it just kind of happened, right? Like Vanderbilt came out on the first drive and took a lead, and they continued it throughout the rest of the game. And every time Alabama started to creep back into it, every time Alabama had an answer, Vandy would do something to respond. So it was not this like crazy chaotic, like if you had taken the names off the jerseys, if you would switch jerseys, you would have said just the same way, like, man, Alabama got out of there with a 40-35 win, but the game was not as close as the score. It was kind of Alabama with the kind of weird fluke plays to keep in this game. The Ryan Williams that you mentioned, which I mean, it is a fluke, but it's also because we've seen it from him.
What more can you say about him, though?
Yeah, it's also not a fluke. It's just kind of Ryan Williams.
When you do it that many times successfully, it's not a fluke anymore.
But you know what I'm talking about.
I know what you mean.
It's just one of these
Anybody
things
else?
where I don't – it's weird because it's obviously such a massive upset because of what Alabama, the program, has been, because of what Vanderbilt, the program, has been. But I also think you have to give credit to Vanderbilt in what they have and are this year, and that is that they are not the pushover that they have been in recent years. And so it was weird to watch this game when I'm sitting there and I'm talking to myself and I'm saying, this Vanderbilt team's not that bad. Like they're not great. They obviously shouldn't be beating Alabama. I think we all understand that. And Alabama's got a couple of different aspects that they're playing with, right? They're coming off that emotional game with Georgia. This is a very clear letdown situation. No one's overly surprised by it. But normally in these letdown situations, they still find a way to win. Georgia would still find a way to win. Texas, I mean, these teams find ways to win these games. Alabama just simply didn't do it. It was incredible to watch because I was with you. There were moments in this game where you're like, you just feel like they're going to grab control. You just felt like there were moments.
You're waiting on it.
When they got it to, I think it was 23-21, you're like, okay, take a breath, get a stop, take the
30
lead.
to 28. 30 to 28.
Is that what it was? Okay. Yeah, you're like, take a breath, get a stop, and you can ride this thing out. It just didn't happen. And when Vandy came around the end and hit Jalen Milroe and he dropped the ball where he was sacked, and you're like, my goodness, they're actually going to do this thing. Pretty stunning. But I mean, it sets you up for a pretty crazy rest of the day into the early evening. But this was the one that's going to draw the headlines for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, and it's not that it was that Vanderbilt's such a bad team this year, because they're not. They're really not. You have the new additions that they've made, like specifically Diego Pavia has been tremendous for them. He's kept them in a lot of football games. They should have won that game against Missouri, and that was a good pull from you. I mean, look, you're in a situation where this squad, if Brock Taylor doesn't miss those 2 field goals in double overtime, then we're talking about this team in a completely different light, potentially. I mean, that's just the way it is. That would be 2 top 10 wins, plus a win against Vanderbilt or over Virginia Tech for Vanderbilt. I mean, that loss to Georgia State seems more and more like the outlier than it is the real declaration of who this team is. But I mean, Diego Pavia, when he outduels Jalen Milroe, a potential Heisman Trophy front runner, that's incredible. I mean, he had an unbelievable game. Cedric Alexander ran for 2 scores in this one. It's just crazy. It's crazy for Vanderbilt. It's an awesome result for them. And I know you say it's not because of the teams on the field necessarily, but it's as much that as it is what these 2 teams represent. And it's just that feeling of just college football personified is the result of this game. Really.
Yeah, I just want to say, like, the thing that I want to caution people on is going like well beyond what this upset was. Vanderbilt was a 22.5-point underdog, right? Like, in comparison, Auburn was a 21.5-point underdog. Like that Auburn, if Auburn, and I know you're dealing with home fields and stuff like that, but like, it would have been a similar upset if Auburn had walked into Georgia and won that game. Now, I know appearances are way different, but I also just want to respect what Vanderbilt is, and we can't just sit here and be unfair to the players and say it's the biggest upset in college football history and SEC history, stuff
not college football history.
No, I know. No, not even SEC. Like, realistically, and I don't have anything at the top of my head, but like not even SEC history. Like in terms of like statistical point spreads, I mean.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's just it's a fun result, and it was an extremely unexpected result that really catapulted the second half of the day.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just it was like, hey, this is a teaser, and this isn't even the last thing. But last thing I will say on this, and I'm going to ask you this question: what's next for Alabama? How do they recover from this? You go from the win, you dominate Wisconsin, then you dominate Georgia in the first half, and then they come storming all the way back. Is this, and I'm asking this almost rhetorically, it's not even a take necessarily. You do everything right in that first half, and then almost seemingly you do everything wrong, and you're saved by this miracle at the very end of the game against Georgia. We talk a lot about, in sports specifically in football, about how teams, sometimes when they turn it off, it's hard to turn back on. I understand you have a full week off, and everything changes there, and things change from week to week. I wonder if the button just sort of stayed off after that second half against Georgia.
No, I completely think that's missing the mark.
Yeah.
I think.
It's a thought that's been
Well,
circulating
and
in my head.
let me work my way through that because I don't mind the question, but I think when you turn something off like Alabama potentially did against Georgia, I think it only I think when you talk yourself into is it tough to turn it back on? I think we're talking about that day, that night when you've taken your foot
I
off the
agree.
gas. I do not think it
Yeah,
carries over, and so to answer your question like directly, no, I don't think it's a carryover from that. Now, do I think it's a hangover a little bit? Do I think that there are emotions that are maybe tough to build back into it? Yes, and I think it's not a hangover necessarily, but to an extent, you got to feel a certain way to provide your best, right?
yeah,
It's no secret that for a long time, Vanderbilt has been a tough place to play because there's no energy in that building. And
it's
the
true.
team has also not been able to match talent. But if Alabama comes in there with no energy and faces a Vanderbilt team that is closer to matching talent than they have been in years past, I think that's what you see yesterday. I think they were flat, not because they turned it off against Georgia or anything like that. They just probably didn't take it seriously. They overlooked their opponent. And quite frankly, they just didn't get their competitive juices going until it was too late.
Yeah. And that's just one of the killers in college football. You have, especially in the SEC, like on a week to week basis, you have a lot of very competent opponents.